Hitler didn't just lose World War II on the battlefield, he lost it through his own mistakes. From invading Russia to declaring war on the US, his blunders doomed the Nazi Empire. Before we dive into Hitler's biggest mistakes that cost him World War II, make sure to subscribe to Open History. Now, let's begin with Hitler's greatest mistakes, how he lost World War II. Adolf Hitler's rise from failed artist and decorated First World War corporal to Führer of Germany reshaped the 20th century. For a while, his gamble paid off. Lightning campaigns in Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France stunned Europe and delivered spectacular early victories. But those successes hid deep strategic weaknesses, a leader increasingly divorced from professional military judgment, driven by ideology and grandiose assumptions, who repeatedly turned operational advantage into strategic catastrophe. This essay examines the principal mistakes that turned Nazi triumph into collapse: the invasion of the Soviet Union, the declaration of war on the United States, the failure to defeat Britain, the mismanagement of the Mediterranean and North African theaters, and the self-inflicted internal doctrinal and political errors that bled German power dry. Where useful, I indicate how historians and military analysts explain the errors and their consequences. Invading the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the turning point. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941, is widely seen as the decisive strategic mistake of Hitler's career. Germany's Wehrmacht enjoyed overwhelming tactical successes in 1941. Deep penetrations, huge encirclements of Soviet formations, and the near collapse of Red Army frontline units. But Hitler's assumptions about the campaign were fatal. He believed post-Soviet state and military would collapse quickly after shock defeats, allowing a fast knockout before winter. That belief ignored key realities: the vastness of the Soviet landmass, the depth of Soviet reserves and industrial capacity, much of which could be moved east of the Urals, and the poor fit between a doctrine designed for short, decisive campaigns and the demands of a protracted land war across immense distances. The Germans had no satisfactory long-term plan for a sustained campaign in Russia. Logistics, lines of communication, and operational reach were all overstretched. Beyond logistics, Barbarossa suffered from flawed priorities and changing objectives. Hitler's ideological objectives, Lebensraum, the destruction of Bolshevism, and the extermination of Jews and communists, pushed goals beyond purely military ones, diverting forces and creating brutal occupation policies that stiffened Soviet resistance and complicated rear area security. German planning repeatedly failed to account for seasonal and climatic extremes. The notorious Rasputitsa, mud season, bogged-down vehicles and supply trains, and Russian winter equipment shortages devastated unprepared troops. When Moscow did not fall in 1941, German momentum stalled. The Red Army recovered, reconstituted armies from Siberian and Far Eastern units, and began to push back. By mid-1942, the initial German advantage had been exhausted. By the end of 1942 and into 1943, catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk turned the Eastern Front into a one-way retreat for Germany. Barbarossa thus converted a calculated risk into a strategic killer. It forced Germany into a war of attrition it could not win. Declaring war on the United States. Removing any doubt, Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941 is often described as an extraordinary strategic blunder, and with good reason. Before Pearl Harbor, the US had been supplying the United Kingdom and the USSR with material through Lend-Lease and escorting convoys, but remained formally neutral in the European war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed American political dynamics. but it did not automatically require Germany to declare war. Yet Hitler did so, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, thereby inviting an industrial colossus into the European theater and effectively uniting the major Allied powers' military-industrial potential against the Axis. Why did Hitler make this choice? A mix of hubris, miscalculation, and propaganda motive. Some German leaders regarded American entry as inevitable. Others thought a formal declaration might legitimize stepped-up submarine warfare against shipping or rally public support. Hitler's personal psychology also mattered. He liked to gamble and, after a string of successes, believed audacity could win. But strategically, the declaration removed the last barrier preventing unfettered American industrial and military involvement in Europe. U.S. shipbuilding, aircraft production, and, crucially, American ground forces and logistics would soon reshape the global balance. The U.S. could sustain large-scale operations in both Atlantic and European theaters. Combined with Britain and the USSR, Allied resources now dwarfed Axis capacity. Hitler's move made German defeat vastly more likely. 3. Failing to defeat Britain, the lost chance in 1940 to 41. Another critical mistake, less obvious than Barbarossa, but equally consequential, was Hitler's failure to secure British dominance in 1940 to 41. After France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone in Europe. If Germany had followed up with a realistic, sustained strategy to force Britain from the war, whether by invasion, blockade, or coercive diplomacy, the European balance could have shifted dramatically. Instead, Hitler allowed the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain and a faulty strategy of aerial and maritime warfare to sap potential victory. The air campaign against Britain shifted from RAF airfields and radar installations to terror bombing of cities, a choice driven in part by reciprocal RAF raids and by Hitler and Goering's simmering preference for terror and prestige targets, and one that let the RAF recover, reorganize, and maintain control of the skies. Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was impossible. Moreover, Britain's survival provided anchor points for a global coalition, bases for American Lend-Lease convoys, hubs for American and Commonwealth forces, and a political center of resistance that precluded German domination of the Atlantic. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat successes in 1940 to 41 were real, but they never delivered a decisive cut to British logistics. Allied industrial output, increasingly aided by America, and improved anti-submarine tactics eventually overcame the U-boat threat. The failure to neutralize Britain left Germany exposed on its western flank for the long haul. 4. Mediterranean and North Africa. Divided focus and missed opportunities. Hitler's partial commitment to the Mediterranean and Africa complexified German strategy. Italy's weakness in North Africa forced German intervention under Rommel. The North African campaign consumed men, material, and attention that might have been redeployed on the Eastern Front or in the fight for naval and air superiority. Likewise, the Balkans campaign in spring 1941, partly influenced by ideological and alliance commitments to Italy and to pro-Axis regimes, delayed Barbarossa by several crucial weeks, shifting the timetable into the autumn and heading toward winter. These diversions were not necessarily fatal in isolation, but they reflected a broader pattern: Hitler's tendency to overextend, to react to alliance politics and prestige concerns, and to pick fights in multiple theaters without adequate resources to sustain them. The result was strategic dispersion, when concentration of force might have yielded decisive results in a single theater. Micromanagement, ideological interference, and the cult of infallibility. Perhaps the most insidious and systemic mistake was Hitler's assumption of near total control over operational military decisions. and his willingness to overrule professional officers. As the war progressed, Hitler increasingly substituted political and ideological aims for sound military calculus, forbidding tactical withdrawals, ordering encircled armies to hold static lines regardless of local reality, and committing forces to symbolic but untenable positions, most famously at Stalingrad. These inflexible commands cost lives, squandered formations, and erased operational initiative. Military professionalism at senior levels was gradually undermined. German generals often could not execute plans without the Führer's explicit approval, while Hitler's choices were shaped more by mythic and racial ambitions than by pragmatic strategy. The consequences were brutal. The disaster at Stalingrad, winter 1942-43, where the Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed after being ordered to stand fast, marked a turning point. Losses were irreplaceable in men and material. German forces lost operational momentum and the capacity to hold wide frontiers. Similarly, the insistence on occupying vast swathes of territory for ideological and extraction purposes created complex partisan and security burdens that diverted combat power from frontline offensives. Hitler's political control thus converted what might have been recoverable military setbacks into strategic collapse. 6. The moral strategic sinkhole, the Holocaust and resource diversion. The Nazi regime's genocidal policies were morally monstrous and strategically damaging. The Holocaust and the broader policy of extermination consumed administrative, logistical, and security resources that could otherwise have supported military operations. Rear security units, transportation networks, and fuel and manpower were diverted to deportations, ghettos, camps, and killing operations. Beyond direct resource costs, the industrialized mass murder hardened resistance in occupied territories, fueled partisan insurgencies, and sapped whatever local cooperation might have been available for German logistics and intelligence. While some historians debate the precise scale of material diversion, the verdict is clear. A regime that prioritized racial policies and extermination over rational military logistics weakened its own war effort in measurable ways. Failure to coordinate and rely on allies, Axis coordination problems also hurt the German cause. Italy's military failures pulled Germany into secondary theaters. German reliance on weak allies forced the Wehrmacht to fill gaps in Sicily, the Balkans, and North Africa. Similarly, the lack of a coherent grand strategy binding Germany, Italy, and Japan into a complementary global plan meant that Axis seizures were opportunistic rather than synergistic. Tokyo pursued its own goals in Asia and the Pacific. Rome frequently demanded aid that German planners could not afford. Hitler's inability or unwillingness to build an effective coalition strategy amplified Germany's overextension. 8. Industrial and economic overreach, the limits of a war economy. Germany's industrial base and resource endowment were limited compared with the combined might of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. Strategic mistakes amplified this structural imbalance. Barbarossa consumed tanks, trucks, and fuel at prodigious rates. Prolonged air and naval campaigns demanded aircraft, carriers, and ships Germany could not produce at Allied scales. The U.S. industrial surge after 1941, millions of vehicles, tens of thousands of aircraft, and an unmatched shipbuilding effort drastically widened the production gap. Hitler's blunders accelerated the point at which Germany's economy could not replace losses, maintain supply lines, or sustain multiple fronts. In short, strategic mistakes converted a contest Germany might have prolonged into one it could not win. Conclusion: the anatomy of overreach. Historians sum up Hitler's greatest mistakes as a cluster of interlocking errors: ideological grandiosity, strategic overreach, misallocation of resources, and the erosion of professional military judgment. Individually, some of these errors might have been survivable. Taken together, and when committed by a regime willing to sacrifice practicality to racism and myth, they produced collapse. Invading the Soviet Union, while Britain remained unneutralized, then declaring war on the United States, effectively invited a coalition whose combined industrial, demographic, and military power Germany could not match. Micromanagement and ideological imperatives turned operational defeats into strategic catastrophes, and the moral disaster of genocidal policies further sapped Germany's ability to prosecute a realistic war. World War II's outcome was never inevitable in 1939, but by 1941–42, the pattern of decisions, Barbarossa, the declaration of war on the US, the failure to neutralize Britain, the diversion of resources to secondary theaters, and Hitler's political control of military affairs had stacked the deck. Those mistakes converted earlier tactical brilliance into strategic defeat and ensured that Nazi Germany's initial lightning would burn itself out in a protracted, grinding collapse.